Episode 4, Sugar, a History. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. The 17th century fundamentally changed how much sugar there was in the world, and that in turn changed the world. But to understand what the world was changing to, I felt it was essential to understand what we were changing from. That means this week we are going all the way back to the beginning of sugar. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. As I mentioned before, one of the reasons I started to dive into this deep, deep pool of food and history was the realization that commodity sugar in Europe, sugar in big enough quantities to have a wholesale market, is older than America, but barely. American food grew up right alongside of regular people, middle and lower class people, non-rich and non-nobility type people, learning to use sugar. So American food has a unique relationship with sugar. Part of the surprise is that on one hand, sugar is as common in America as salt or water. It is one of those things that when I run out, I'm a little baffled. How did that happen? There's always sugar. But the more I thought about it, there wasn't always sugar, or at least not in Europe. And in parts of the world, sure, sugar's there, but on the edge. It isn't part of the food like it is in America. One of the first times I realized that other parts of the world have a different relationship with sugar, and other ingredients, of course, was as a kid going out to Chinese and Japanese restaurants. Back when I was a tiny child, and bones had cords, going out to eat was exciting. We could usually order dessert. But if you turned to the back of a Chinese menu, there was no dessert. At the Japanese restaurant, there wasn't either. But you got oranges cut up in ways I had never thought of cutting up oranges. Oh, and if you're wondering, the Chinese food I ate then pretty much tasted like Panda Express, but we dressed up for it and got menus. The whole development of Chinese food in America we won't really get into until we hit railroad mania in the last third of the 19th century. So just back burner that for now. Anyway, why didn't 20th century Chinese restaurants have a dessert menu? Other than the fact that Chinese meals have a fundamentally different organization than American meals, a big reason was that a middle-of-the-road American with the extremely narrow tastes of the second half of the 20th century, what they thought of as dessert was not what a Chinese chef would make as a sweet treat. The combination of spices, the inclusion of savory ingredients would just be weird, and it wouldn't sell. Great examples of this are chicken cookies. They don't contain any chicken. And red bean buns, which I actually love. Anyway, see the show notes for details on those items. On the other hand, Indian restaurants definitely had dessert, and they seemed almost right. Milk, sugar, rice, but too sweet, and weird spices. And what have they done with the milk? This is not ice cream. And then there were those strange rumors that before Columbus, Mexicans used to drink hot chocolate with chilies, but no sugar. Remember, I was a kid before there was Google. Yeah, I was starting to get the picture, even back then, that something was different about how other parts of the world related to sugar. It has taken me a few decades, but I finally get to take a deep dive, more of a speed drive-by, of what happened to other people's food as sugar traveled towards America. And note, this is specifically sugar, not sweet stuff in general. That is a whole other thing. First, sugarcane is a grass, and if you've ever nibbled on the tender, pale grass stems as a kid, you know this is true. All grass, lawn type or tall and wild, contains a fleeting sweetness. Second, sugar cane and sugar got to America the long way around. Really. Sugarcane's initial domestication was in Papua New Guinea about 8,000 BCE. And if internet maps and or not being able to travel has made your mental geography rusty, Papua New Guinea is that island Australia sort of wears like a fascinator. So even though sugar cane started just across the Pacific Ocean from future America, it went first through Asia, Africa, Europe, South America, that is, every other continent except Australia and Antarctica, before it would get to North America. The journey from Papua New Guinea started with a jump to the Philippines, India, and Indonesia, though there's reasonable evidence sugarcane was domesticated independently in Indonesia. The first written evidence of sugar appears in a Sanskrit grammar from around 400 to 350 BCE, where there are mentions of sugar mixed with other things like rice and milk for a sort of pudding, barley meal, and fermented drinks. The drink was flavored with ginger and sugar, so the first ginger beer? Sugar cane was a wonder to those encountering it. Nearchus, a general serving under Alexander the Great, wrote about what most people assume is sugar during his mid-4th century BCE voyage from the mouth of the Euphrates River to the mouth of the Indus. Just a 1,400-ish mile jaunt. What he wrote was, "A reed in India brings forth honey without the help of bees, from which an intoxicating drink is made, though the plant bears no fruit." Anyway, the word saccharon was known to Pliny and Dioscorides, who were both prolific Greek authors of the 1st century CE. Dioscorides, who wrote an Herbal, which is a catalog of the natural world, especially the plants, included this: "There is a kind of concreted honey called saccharon, found in reeds in India and Arabia Felix, like in consistence to salt, and brittle to be broken between the teeth, as salt is. It is good for the belly and the stomach, being dissolved in water, and so drank." And the first discussion of processing sugar into crystals shows up in writing in India, in a discourse on moral consciousness, around 500 CE. Clearly, refining sugar into crystals had been going on for quite a while if discussions of sugar technology are part of a philosophical discourse. By the 7th century, there is evidence that Arab traders were regularly moving refined sugar products around the caliphates of medieval Islam, so it is extremely likely that there was some use of sugar in the northern Mediterranean states. In its early days, sugar was not always crystals. It was also traded as a thick, sticky, brownish syrup, so it could have easily been mistaken for honey by those who had no knowledge of sugar. And this dig into history answers one question for me. I used to wonder why older recipes for baklava always use sugar, not honey. But looking at the wide variety of sugar recipes in Persian and Arab cookbooks shows that early Greek pastries were made in a world that already had sugar syrup. Like salt, a high concentration of sugar is an effective preservative in warm climates. It keeps pastry from disintegrating or molding and stops nuts from going rancid. It all makes sense now. Now, since Arab traders were moving sugar products all around the Mediterranean world, all through the Middle Ages, there are fun surprises to be found by looking at the Arabic sugar words that have been absorbed and laundered into English. The Arabic sherba was a high-viscosity sugar syrup, gloopy, like honey. The word appears as syrup in English and in other languages it would have wandered through, like French, Russian, and German. All have syrup. In Italian, it's siropo. Now, in Spanish, it's jarabe, and in Portuguese, xarobe, which also makes sense because Arabic speakers were living in the Iberian Peninsula until at least the 14th century. Sherba was added to fruit and water and sometimes mixed with ice to make a concoction known as sharbat, which gets us to sherbet. sorbet, sorbetto. You get it. My favorite is the Arabic juleb, which was a botanical decoction, rose petals crushed in boiling water, to which sugar was added, also sometimes served over ice. When it came to Europe, mint often replaced the rose. By the time it got to America, it had become the mint julep. Mint leaves crushed into sugar or sugar syrup with bourbon added, and then lots of ice. And if you look at modern Arabic recipes, jalab is still there as a fruit syrup with rose water. Okay, back to old sugar. The line in between using sugar as a medicine or a food was very muddy from its introduction, all the way up to the 18th century. I was about to go into a quick explanation of how 17th century / late medieval medical theory worked, but since that isn't possible, if you are interested, I'm putting out a bonus episode this Friday that introduces the terms and ideas I will refer to as we head towards the 18th century. Food will get more complex than just food for rich people and food for poor people. It gets more categories. There is man food and lady food. There is food for children and food for the old and sick people. And the categories were linked to the medieval medical ideas of humorism and solidism. These ideas hang on, even today, as little hobgoblins in the collective Western food consciousness. Now remember, before the 17th century, sugar was expensive. Before the 16th century, it was like saffron expensive. Gold was cheaper. So it was only a medicine and food for the very well-born or the extremely rich, sort of a goop potion of its day. And because it was so expensive and so popular, money, muscle, and technology were all invested in producing more. Sugar plantations were set up all around the eastern Mediterranean world. Egypt, the Levant, that is, modern Lebanon, Jerusalem, and on islands like Crete, Cyprus, Rhodes, and Malta. As the Arab world spread across North Africa, so did sugar plantations until they reached southern Spain in the 8th century. Yes, as the History of Rome podcast points out, Spain was the new world of the old world. First silver mines run by the Romans, and then sugar plantations run by the Arabs. Western Europe, north of the Pyrenees, also discovered sugar around the 8th century when knights and pilgrims bashed about the Mediterranean world on travels to the Holy Land. They also encountered the technology Arab civilization had developed to grow, harvest, and refine it. In fact, when Catholic nobles set up the Kingdom of Jerusalem run by the Frankish Baldwins in the 11th and 12th centuries, they also took over Arab sugar plantations outside Jericho and started shipping the stuff home. Sugar was so popular back home as food, medicine, and opulent decor, Western Europeans decided to expand their sugar ventures. Islands were a very popular place to put sugar plantations since the slaves, both purpose-captured slaves and POWs, had a harder time escaping, and it limited theft of the sugar. It was the Portuguese that first started sugar islands outside the Mediterranean. They went to the islands off the coast of northwest Africa, first Madeira, then the Canaries, Cape Verde Islands, and later Sao Tome. They were a sort of combined prison/money-making venture/sailor outpost and supply station. Prince Henry's 15th century Portuguese fleet used them as bases during their piracy and commercial ventures in West Africa. The 15th century is also when sugar in Europe went from being a fabulously luxurious food and medicine to a political object to fight over, like gold or land or the interpretation of Scripture. When Columbus came back with reports of a zillion little hot islands in the New World, the Vatican had just split the Atlantic Ocean south of Gibraltar between the Spanish and Portuguese to get them to quit with all their annoying squabbling. They did this with the Treaty of Tordesillas. Everything 370 leagues, that is 1,185 miles, west of the Cape Verde Islands belonged to Spain. Everything east of the line belonged to Portugal, which it turned out included a 500-mile-wide slice of future Brazil. Since Portugal said, sure, fine, it makes me think Portugal knew perfectly well that Brazil was out there. We'll get to that more when we get to fish. Columbus brought sugar to the Caribbean on his second voyage in 1493 and forced the local Taino people to grow it when it turned out they really didn't have that much gold. By 1500 or 1501, Columbus's colony had killed so many of the Taino in pursuit of mining and sugar projects and just generally being terrible people, he had to ask the Spanish crown to send him a shipment of West Africans. These men arrived in 1503, and this shipment was the very first government subsidy of sugar in the New World. This led sugar to be called the favored child of capitalism. Columbus's colony at Santo Domingo shipped their first sugar back to Spain in 1516. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, South America, and North America would continue to grow by importing enslaved workers until 1791, when the only successful slave revolt in the Americas turned French Saint-Domingue, that is, Santo Domingo, where Columbus started, into Haiti. By 1526, Brazil was shipping sugar to Portugal in commercial quantities. Soon Spain's plantations in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, that set of islands known as the Greater Antilles, took the lead. There is speculation that the silver trade grabbed more of the Spanish attention and energy, and that is why they lost ground. But there are other arguments that point out that Spain was the first on the scene with plantations that depended on slave labor. And over again, it has been shown that dependence on slaves degrades respect for human effort and saps the will to innovate. Advances in irrigation stalled out with the Arabs before the 8th century. The last major cane processing innovation came in the 15th century with the adaptation of an Egyptian mill. This same water, human, or animal-powered mill was found all throughout the Americas up until the 19th century. The fact that, after the 15th century, there were no major technological advances in sugar processing until sugar planters were forced to pay for labor lends weight to this argument. We will see this same dynamic play out again and again with other foods. When labor is done by people who are also making the money, there is innovation. When labor is done by slaves or people regarded as low or lesser or contemptible, conditions are often dangerous, crowded, and even deadly. Innovation is seen as unnecessary, needlessly expensive, or even disruptive. With so much money to be made from sugar, its production rose to the level of industry. From planting the cane to sending off barrels of sugar and molasses, production and processing went year-round. There was no off-season, no time for resting. At the opening of the 17th century, this was the state of sugar in the New World. Spain had a clear lead in sugar production. Portugal was importing West Africans for the Spanish and their own sugar works in Brazil. The Dutch and British and French were cracking their knuckles, getting ready to start throwing elbows and stomping all over the Treaty of Tordesillas. After all, it had been issued by the Roman Catholic Church, an authority Britain and the Low Countries no longer recognized as the boss of them. So I hope you'll join me next week as I actually start on sugar in America in the 17th century. You'll get to see how sugar actually financed much of the startup costs of the New World, what the British did, what the colonists did and did not do, and how the late 80s sitcom Designing Women contains a callback to luxurious European pastry arts. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com, along with promised pictures, links, and a few maps. I'll also include any interesting books I read for this episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also on the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.